Good morning. It's a real pleasure to be here, and frankly, it's very impressive to see the province of Alberta bringing together this type of meeting where we've got multiple stakeholders in the room talking to each other, hopefully not past each other, which often happens, but being in one confined space for a day, I think can get us a long way in terms of sharing perspectives and ideas and thoughts about any particular topic, this one for today. And it doesn't happen as often as it should. So I'm delighted to be a part of this. I congratulate the Institute for Health Economics in bringing this together, and very much look forward to a lot of good discussion over the course of the day. Just a couple of updates on my profile and introduction. So while I live in New Jersey, I'm not from New Jersey. I'm actually from New Zealand, which is a much more interesting part of the world, I might say. Though I enjoy living in New Jersey. And also, as you can see from the slides, they're branded the IMS Institute for Healthcare Informatics. As of Monday this week, IMS Health and Quintiles merged formally. So we are now, as a company, known as Quintiles IMS, and our institute going forward will be referred to as the Quintiles IMS Institute, and we'll get our branding up to date in a few days. But it's a pleasure to be here and to be able to share sort of our views on the topic of biosimilars. We've been watching this space fairly closely for several years. I mean, it's really a decade, since biosimilars first became available in Europe, and so we've been watching what's been happening there fairly closely. In the US, of course, things are moving relatively slowly. It's still a big topic that doesn't get stakeholders together, so it's actually not moving as fast as it should in the US, but that's a different topic. What I've prepared is a presentation organized around sort of 4 themes. First, I do think it's useful to frame the biosimilar landscape. Why is it important? Why are we talking about it? And address some of the issues around biologics overall, and then the role of biosimilars as a subset of biologics. Then we'll talk about how we see different health systems, particularly across Europe, approaching biosimilars from an access and reimbursement perspective. And the short answer is everyone's doing it somewhat differently. And there is no cookie cutter that is being applied, and I think that speaks again to the value of today's discussion, which is to identify a way forward that fits the Alberta health system. I'll talk a little bit about the outcomes that have been achieved in Europe, the way that we're tracking utilization and pricing related to biosimilars, and then just a final thoughts from my perspective from the outside as I think about this topic. What are the considerations perhaps for Alberta and for you to consider? So let's begin with with framing the biosimilar landscape, and I think the reason this gets a lot of attention is that we've seen over the past 10 years a pretty significant increase in the role that biologics play. And when I use the term biologics now, I'm meaning both branded biologics, the originators or the reference products as they're referred to in that video, as well as biosimilars. So we've seen an expansion of the role and the use of these drugs in treating patients. We've seen a corresponding increase in the amount being spent on these medicines, and a growing share of overall drug budgets. We also, when we look in the pipeline, the R&D pipeline of the industry, we see that innovation is going to extend the use of biologics, at least for the next 10 years. We've got pretty good visibility as to what new drugs are going to come out over the next 5 years and a little bit longer than that. So we know that this is a moving target, and I think that's a really important consideration as you think about policy, is not setting policy for today, but in a way that will be sustainable, and understanding what's coming through the pipeline is important. And then we also observe that we've got a large number of manufacturers who are very aggressively pursuing the development of a large number of biosimilars. I mean, the pipeline of biosimilars that are in development today is really quite significant, and it's clearly a hot area from a business perspective, as well as a hot area from a health system perspective. So just to show a few facts on this. So this is tracking the global use of different biologics used in different disease areas over the last 10, 12 years. So indexed back to 100 in 2003, and here we're measuring sort of days of therapy. That's the unit that we've measured across. So you can see how oncology sits at the top. So a 7-fold increase in the volume of biologics used in the treatment of cancer since 2003. Autoimmune disorders, and of course those come in many different forms, a five-fold increase since 2003. Growth stimulating factors, diabetes, erythropoietins, slightly lower, but still these are sort of fairly dramatic sort of increases in the use of biologics, and therefore the role that they are playing in treating patients. When we look across countries, we see that there's quite a wide variation in terms of the per capita utilization. So this is it's a crude measure to compare countries simply on a population basis, and here we're measuring what we call standard units of biotech products per capita, and we've identified the main therapy areas. Diabetes by volume is the largest, so that's where all the insulins sit, of course. Oncology, autoimmune are smaller segments on a total per capita basis. But again, this gives you a sense of the sort of variability between countries. These are the 9 largest developed economies in the world that we track as a cohort, and you can see where Canada sits in that view. If we just isolate the oncology and autoimmune areas, which are the 2 groups of biologics where we would say there's the most activity, both from an innovation perspective as well as from the perspective of the role that biosimilars can play. This is just looking at those 2 areas on a standard unit per capita basis, and again showing the variability between the US at sort of 0.1 standard units per capita in 2015, down to a low of less than about a tenth of that in the case of South Korea. Again, Canada, you can see where it sits. Again, these are not meant to be used to make any profound sort of implications, but merely to talk about the inherent variability between countries in terms of the use of biologics, and undoubtedly, if we broke each country down in a more granular way, we'd find similar levels of utilization. Certainly in the US, when you look at things on a statewide level, there's enormous variability that isn't always very well explained. Another reason why there can be differences in the utilization of biologics is because some biologics are available in some countries but not in others. So And again, we're talking broadly of biologics here. This is looking at all of the new biologics that were launched in a 5-year period, 2010 to 2014, somewhere in the world for the first time. So what we call a global first launch. There were 45 of them over that 5-year period. And then what this chart is showing is how many of those 45 were available in each country as of the end of 2015. And by available, we mean registered and sales are being tracked. Patients are actually utilizing the drug. It may be through public programs or private insurance. We're not differentiating that. We're simply saying, are these molecules being used by patients in these countries? And again, this speaks to different countries having different approaches, both from a regulatory perspective as well as from a market access perspective, actually getting the product on the market. It also speaks to manufacturers having different approaches to submitting applications for registration, for reimbursement in individual countries. But it's a fairly dramatic difference. Again, these are all developed countries, and we're not talking to the rate of utilization, simply is the molecule somewhere being used in the country. So you can see here where Canada sits with 16 of those 45 molecules being available, again, as of the end of 2015. As time goes on, presumably more of that cohort of 45 would become available in Canada, but that's the snapshot anyway that we look at. So availability of biologics is variable and certainly a factor in considering the role for biosimilars. And also, as I mentioned, when we look back into the pipeline at biologics that are in clinical development, in this case, this is looking specifically at clinical development phase 2 or phase 3, or the molecule is in the registration phase. You can see that the biologics in the dark part of the bar are sort of representing sort of 20-30% of the pipeline in a number of areas, including some where biologics have already not had a significant role historically. So cardiovascular, for example, the PCSK9s that have recently come through into the market, large molecules, competing or providing treatment options amidst a sea of small molecule treatments for cardiovascular disease. Respiratory as well, we've got biologics coming through. Derm, pain, migraine is one area where there's a lot of activity now, bringing forward biologics potentially for the treatment of migraine. So the message is that biologics are an important part of the armamentarium today, and certainly for the next 5 years, and we can already say for 10 years, there'll be no slowdown in that. I would also say that that's in the context of an R&D pipeline of innovation that has never been fuller, whether you're looking at small molecules or large molecules. And I do think it's a consideration for health systems to recognize just how many new medicines there are coming down the line. There have never been more, especially in cancer, but certainly not limited to that area. So we do have another decade at least of significant innovation that we can comfortably foresee. So how does all this translate to drug budgets? And the answer is, globally, a lot of money is spent on biologic medicines. Our estimate is that by 2020, globally, there'll be about $400 billion spent on biologics of all types, originals or biosimilars. And that's out of about $1.2 trillion for all medicines, including small molecules. So it's about 800 billion for small molecules, 400 for biologics. And that percentage has been growing. You can see the growth rate over the last, historically over the last 10 years and for the next 5 years, sort of typically at or above 10%. And that's at or above the overall market rate. So biologics have been becoming a larger percentage of drug budgets, driven by the innovation and the utilization. You can see the individual country forecasts there. So this is based on an IMS health team that called Market Prognosis that undertakes country level forecasting, has models and so on, including one for Canada, that incorporates assumptions about biosimilars and pricing and access and new products and so on. And you can see actually Canada comes in there at a relatively modest 3.2% compound annual growth rate in constant dollars over the next 5 years. We can have a separate discussion, whether that number's right or not. The US, on the other hand, a much more bullish sort of 14% growth, which clearly will bring a lot of stress into the US health system. So a lot of money, spending levels above the average of the total drug budget, and therefore a lot of attention. And then you couple that with the reality that patents do expire on all drugs, and that includes biologics. And this is now back to a European view of the largest biologic molecules by sales in 2015. And we've indicated there the expiry date for the patent, and you can see for a large number of them, the patent has already expired. And for those that haven't, they'll expire by 2020. Now, patent expiries are a little bit of a judgment call, and exact timing of patent expiries varies. Lawyers make a lot of money challenging and defending patents. So these are the IMS Health views of whether, in fact, a patent has expired or when it will expire. Parenthetically, this is a very big issue in the US, which is now holding up approved biosimilars that have been approved by the FDA, but which are now in the middle of legal dispute in terms of whether they're infringing on existing patents. But the point is, patents are expiring, and therefore that opens the gates for biosimilars to enter. And there's a lot of them in development. As I said, we're struggling to sort of keep up to date on exactly how many separate biosimilars are coming through the R&D process. So here we've arrayed around the circle 7 different biologic molecules, and each dot represents a different company's biosimilar that's in some stage of development, whether it be sort of preclinical or early phase development, or in already registered or filed. So there's a lot of dots. We've actually just updated this chart as of this is, I think, as the end of 2015. We just updated it as of the end of September, and there are more dots, to be clear. So a lot of activity, a lot of investment by a lot of different companies. So this is sort of our view of which companies currently have biosimilars actually in registration, already registered, they're in pre-registration, or they're in phase 3 of clinical development. So this doesn't include all the rest that are in early stages. And it's a long list of companies. By the way, a lot of them only have one in late stage. So this is still an emerging industry. And we've got a mix of large global pharmaceutical companies typically with a heritage in biologic development and production, including Pfizer, Novartis, which includes the Sandoz division, Boehringer Ingelheim. We've got other companies that are focused almost entirely on biotech, such as Amgen, but which historically have been bringing innovative biologics to market, but are now also bringing biosimilars to market. We call out Korea because that's been a real sort of hotbed of activity led by Celltrion and Samsung Bioepis, which are two companies that have really been out in front in many respects in terms of bringing biosimilars to regulators, getting approval, and getting those drugs into the market, and doing so in a way which has appeared from the outside to be relatively straightforward, sort of clean reviews by the regulators, and relatively straightforward approval processes. And those two companies, by the way, don't have a long, storied heritage in biologic development and production, which we think is interesting, given the complexity that we heard about in the video of developing and producing these molecules. Here's a couple of relatively new players who are being very successful in bringing these drugs into the marketplace. So there's a lot of activity, a lot of interest. Again, I think that's relevant as you think about the way forward with respect to biosimilars. Not all these companies are going to make it, however, and I think that does bring us back to this issue of the sustainability of a competitive biosimilar market. Right now, it's a bit of a free-for-all, we would say, in terms of the number of companies that are declaring their interest in biosimilars and are putting investment into the biosimilar field. But inevitably, there will be a winnowing out over time, a narrowing down, a consolidation of some extent. And part of that comes back to whether, in fact, there's a business in biosimilars and whether that business is viewed as being sustainable. And I think we'll probably come back to that topic as it relates to pricing and price negotiation for biosimilars. How do we ensure that there is a sustainable market, a competitive but sustainable market for biosimilars and for enough companies to stimulate real competition, which ultimately benefits the health system. All right, so that's my sort of big picture of why biologics are important and the potential for biosimilars in that context. Let's now take a look at how we have been observing different health systems approaching the issue of biosimilar access and reimbursement and so on. And we would say broadly there's sort of four elements to think about. In an ideal world, these actually sort of come together and are integrated in some way. Doesn't necessarily always happen that way. But the four areas basically would say are the approach that's being taken to pricing and the setting of price or the negotiated price and reimbursement that's achieved, the procurement, and again, the negotiation with manufacturers in order to procure the biosimilars. There's a set of issues around how biosimilars get prescribed by prescribers, and then finally how they are dispensed, either in hospital or in retail settings. So if we think about the sort of pricing and reimbursement approach, that's looking at what happens to the price level of the originator when it faces a biosimilar competitor, and in some countries, by regulation, that price level gets adjusted. In others, the price level is being adjusted, but it's being adjusted by the manufacturer of the originator in order to maintain share. There's the price level of the biosimilar relative to the originator, and then what pricing mechanisms are applicable to both. And again, that spans the range from free market pricing to government mandated price levels. And if we look at just some of the examples, in Germany, there is a quote unquote free pricing for biosimilars, as there is for all drugs in the German market. At the same time, it may be free pricing, but it's also clear that major discounts relative to the originator medicine are expected and indeed are being negotiated. Likewise in the UK, where we also have a quote free pricing model in place for biosimilars, but they are still subject to the PPRS regulations, and therefore they are indirectly controlled. In a country like Italy, in the retail setting, biosimilar pricing is set at 25 to 35% lower than the innovator's original price, and there's a mandatory price cut on the originator when a biosimilar enters the market. Poland also a mandatory discount. And then we've got several countries using reference pricing models of one type or another, international reference pricing or local reference pricing. And we would say, in multiple countries, the biosimilar and the originators are both being included in the same reference price group. So again, even though, as you heard from the video, these the biosimilars are not the same or bioequivalent in small molecule terms as the reference product, from a pricing and reimbursement approach perspective, we do see multiple countries viewing them as being sufficiently similar to fit within the same reference pricing group. From the procurement perspective, it's really, the issue is how tenders are used to essentially to negotiate price and volume arrangements with manufacturers, and then the sort of scope of the tender, which can vary from a national tender covering the entire population and health system to a regional or even a local or hospital tender. So again, the way in which this plays out is very much determined by how purchasing is actually done in these countries and the role that tenders can make. So again, in the UK, we've got regional tenders that are in place for medicines if they're considered interchangeable. And in the case of the UK, EPO, the erythropoietins are considered interchangeable for the purposes of the four major regional tenders, but the Neupogen molecules are not, and infliximab is not considered interchangeable either. So again, we've got an approach, but it also is being applied in a different way depending on the different molecule that's being looked at. And I think we'll come back to this issue of, from a policy perspective, how do you set policies that can adequately differentiate different kinds of biologic molecules. In Spain, we've got regional or local tenders for originators and biosimilars together for naive patients, but for those patients already under treatment, that's separately negotiated with the manufacturers. In Italy, things are rolling out at a provincial level, and again, different provinces are moving in different directions and at different speeds in terms of how that procurement is being applied. Prescribing, the issues here are really around initiation and switching, and in that context, when is it appropriate for the biosimilar to be used? Is it restricted? Is it considered appropriate only for the biosimilar to be used at initiation of treatment, or is it considered appropriate for a patient to be switched from from the originator or one biosimilar to a biosimilar or another biosimilar? I think education programs, particularly around that are key opinion leader-led programs around appropriate treatment guidelines. These are an important part of the decision-making landscape for biosimilar use. And again, this is an area where across different countries we see, in some cases a very hands-on approach and others a very hands-off approach. But it's clearly a big factor in terms of bringing clinicians to a point where they are comfortable in the prescribing decisions that they are making for their patients, and I'm sure we'll have a lot of discussion about that. And then I think there's a separate set of issues around what we refer to as incentives that are provided to prescribers, and those can be positive incentives. Your hospital gets to keep some share of the savings if you're using a lower cost drug, and your hospital can decide how they want to spend that additional budget, or they can be in the form of quotas that are set, and with the prospect that if quotas for biosimilar use are not met, then there's some sort of a penalty to the prescribing entity. So these, we would say, are an important factor. I think this gets into slightly difficult situations where I think we're all reluctant to talk about financial incentives to promote the particular use of particular types of medicine. At the same time, it seems that incentives can be used to stimulate at least an openness to alternatives that prescribers might otherwise not be so open to. So again, I'm sure we'll come back to talking about this, but again, you can see the examples here that there's a range of approaches being taken. There's a range of the sort of softly versus more draconian kind of measures that are imposed. Our sense is also this is something that changes over time as the health system and its approach to biosimilars matures in some way. So I think this is one of those areas where there isn't, again, a ideal way to approach things today that will necessarily be the right way 5 years from now or 10 years from now. So I do think, building in mechanisms for flexibility is important, and I think something that should be discussed. And then finally, dispensing. So the big question here is there able to be automatic substitution of a biosimilar if a physician has written a prescription or recommended the use of a different biologic? And the common answer to that is there is no automatic substitution of dispensing really in any health system. So everyone has pulled back from that, even when it is applied in the case of small molecules, and certainly in most or all cases, a consultation with the prescribing clinician is required, certainly before a pharmacist can substitute one for another. In Germany, there is a bioidentical term that gets used, which in that case really means the biosimilar is manufactured by the same company as an alternative biosimilar or the reference product, in which case it can be substituted. But in general, that's not the substitution or interchangeability is not being applied. All right, let me just a reflection, because on these differences that we see across health systems, because it's not always that helpful for me to stand up and say, well, actually everyone's doing it slightly differently. But I think it's important to think about why are there differences across systems, and I think these are some of the factors to consider as you think about what's right for Alberta. I think the starting point is when we look across countries, there's still in 2016 differences in the culture of a health system, right? So, and by that I mean taking the totality of payers, of prescribers, of regulators, of patients, of pharmacists as they think about medicines. There's still different views about the role of small molecules, right? We still see very different generic penetration rates across countries. We see different approaches still being taken, different attitudes, even again within the developed markets, but certainly across all of Europe. That suggests there's still a different culture there in terms of how to think about generics relative to brands. There's also significant difference in biologics use. So you saw from the earlier charts that some countries use biologics a whole lot more than others. And in Europe in particular, we've been watching how the sort of former Eastern European countries and health systems, which really had very limited access to and use of biologics until biosimilars became affordable, their whole culture around using biologics for the treatment of autoimmune disorders or rheumatoid arthritis or Crohn's disease or psoriasis and so on is quite different than in other countries. So I think that is a factor to consider, and it's certainly a driver of the differences that we see across Europe. The strength of clinical evidence and the strength of the champions of that clinical evidence and the role that they play in health systems, we also see as being a driver of difference. So again, some countries have very coherent and powerful groups of clinicians who are very effective at driving clinical practice across the country. And others not so much, right? It's much more decentralized or localized or even individualized. So there's a variability in terms of what level of clinical evidence is needed to drive a behavioral change, and what's the strength of sort of champions of that clinical evidence. Again, we see this manifest itself every day in terms of the uptake of particularly of new medicines. Some countries it happens very quickly, some countries it happens very, very slowly, and not because of cost, but simply because of clinical practice and how long it takes for clinical practice to evolve. The organization of healthcare, the level of decision-making, the level of fragmentation, clearly a significant driver of difference. How consolidated is the health system? How monolithic is it? And linked to that, the organization of purchasing. And who does hold the budget? And who does hold the responsibility for purchasing? And then finally, this sort of culture of the notion of incentives to affect prescriber behavior. Is there a culture of that? And is it a positive incentive? Is it a negative incentive? Do incentives work, in fact? what kind of incentives work differs, again, culturally and certainly by health system. So, we look at this list of reasons why we see significant differences across countries, again, in biosimilars uptake, but actually in lots of other areas as well. And I think that some of the factors that should be thought about when any health system is trying to map a way forward. What I would also say in terms of the role of biosimilars is we've thought about how health systems can ensure that biosimilars bring sort of real value to the health system. And when we say value, we mean that biosimilars do play a role in a health system. They do provide a safe and effective treatment option that can come at a lower cost to the health system. But in order to unlock that potential, we'd say there has to be alignment around these four factors, starting with the education piece, education of physicians and patients and payers. There's got to be effective negotiation of pricing and volume. By the way, it's not just about price. A lot of this is about volume, and I'm sure we'll talk more about that. The issue of incentives, balanced incentives, and those are incentives perhaps for physicians or prescribers. There are also incentives for manufacturers to want to come into the market, to want to compete against others in the marketplace, with the incentive of actually providing some commercial returns that can keep them in business. Right, so it's fairly obvious, but there does need to be some financial return at the end of the day for manufacturers to stay in the market. Just as there has to be an economic incentive for the innovators to continue to innovate, and for that return on investment in economic terms to be valuable, so that more capital gets invested to develop the next generation of medicines. And that sort of links to the final point, which is this notion of active and sustained competition. And we'd say that this is about ensuring that there's a system where there is active competition. There's more than one player in town, or two, or three. More than three is really important to, based on sort of economic theory. And that competition has to be active, but it's also got to be sustained. So, we may have 2 years of active competition or 5 years of active competition, but then if a lot of players drop out of the market, that level of competition falls down, and then you're subject to all sorts of lower value contribution, shall we say, from biosimilars. So thinking about what it takes to sustain the competition but still make it active, we think is also important. All right, I'm going to run fairly quickly because I suspect we'll come back to some of this in the afternoon session, but I want to take you through some of the metrics that we have been tracking across Europe. This is all in the public domain. We've been doing this for the European Commission. We've been setting up KPIs so that the European Commission can look at how individual countries are embracing and utilizing biosimilars. But I want to sort of tick through some of the five observations that we've come up with. And again, there's a document on the European Commission's website you can look at for this. And before I get here, let me say a couple of things about the IMS numbers. One is our price information is not perfect. We do not capture the off-invoice rebates and the discounting that we know happens more in some countries than others, that pulls prices down. What we're tracking is essentially list prices or invoice prices, but we know that there are other factors that bring prices down. So anything you see here with price information is probably, if anything, overstated. And then secondly, on the volume, we've been taking a view that the relevant metric in volume is patient treatment days, or treatment days. And that's not easy to calculate for all biologics. The World Health Organization has their defined daily dose measure, which works fairly well for small molecules, less perfectly for large molecules, where there can be some significant variability in what a daily dose of a biologic looks like. So there's some issues around measuring this. We'll come back again, I think, in talking about KPIs as to what the right measures are. But we've used in this data treatment days. What this chart shows and speaks to is that competition from biosimilars does result in driving down price. Which is not a big surprise, but it's always good to see that not only in the accessible market for biosimilars, which would be the biosimilar and its reference product, but indeed in the total market for these four therapy areas, we've seen a decline in the average price per treatment day after the arrival of biosimilars relative to what that price was before biosimilars came into the market. In the case of anti-TNFs, you can see it's relatively modest, and that's because we've only got one biosimilar molecule with one anti-TNF molecule with a biosimilar competitor, infliximab. Whereas EPO and certainly filgrastim, it's a narrower portfolio of molecules and a more significant price decline, plus the biosimilars have been in the market longer. When we look across countries, there's pretty wide variability. Again, be careful because some countries have more off-invoice rebates than others, so that can distort things. We would say that it's sort of coming in at sort of a 50 to 70% price reduction level, meaning the price per treatment day in 2015 compared to that price per treatment day prior to the biosimilar entrance. I think it's also important to realize that until infliximab biosimilar became available, we were talking about epoetins, the growth-stimulating factors, and the human growth hormones as being the categories with biosimilar availability. Those are all fairly small markets. The anti-TNFs is a much bigger market. The oncologics are a much bigger market. So we're a little careful to say what happened in those initial three therapy areas where biosimilars have been available for 10 years is necessarily translatable to what we'll see with the anti-TNFs and in oncology. The second observation is that the correlation between the level of price reduction and the market share that biosimilars take is fairly weak. So each dot here is a country. So those countries with the sort of deepest price reductions don't necessarily have the highest penetration of the biosimilars. And you can see if you look at the 20% line for the price reduction, the biosimilar share is from sort of about 0 to about 50% of the market. So a wide variability there. So it's not all about price is the lesson from that. And I think I've tried to make that point from the earlier discussion, but this sort of simple notion that lower prices means the biosimilar will gain significant share is really not true, no matter which of the therapy areas you look at. The third observation is that competition from biosimilars can also influence the behavior of the originator. That's one of the reasons you saw the pattern in the prior chart. And there's a couple of different dynamics that can play out here. One is the availability of next generation patent protected biologics and how those, in the case of filgrastim, the PEG filgrastim Neulasta, in the case here of Denmark, has become, the major part of the market prior to the biosimilar filgrastim becoming available. So this notion, again, that we have a static set of medicines in any particular therapy area is really doesn't reflect reality, right? There's always an evolution in the treatment to next generation, and how that plays into the utilization of biosimilars is really important to understand, as you can see from this chart. We also see in some markets and in some molecules that the original product will also reduce its price in order to maintain share. So this is the case of growth hormone in Sweden, and the dark blue line is the referenced product, which you can see reduced its price by about 70% at the time that the biosimilars came in, again in an effort to maintain share. All of which brings savings to the health system, but it's important to remember that the originators have their strategies as well at a time when biosimilars are entering the market. The fourth observation really relates to what I mentioned earlier about the utilization of biologics, particularly in the Eastern European countries, which historically has been very, very low. With the availability of small molecules, with the availability of biosimilars, that utilization has risen in some cases quite dramatically. So this gets to the issue of expanded access to a biologic product when biosimilars at lower prices do become available. And the extent to which that is desirable, whether that's bringing benefits to patients, depends a little bit on whether in fact you believe that the original biologics were being used optimally prior to the availability of the biosimilars. The final observation here is that in addition to the differences that I talked about by country or by health system, individual products also look fairly different, right? So when we look at the 5 major biosimilar molecules that are now available, there's a lot of variability in terms of how those molecules get used, where they get administered to patients, whether it's a short duration therapy or a chronic therapy, whether it's in the case of the autoimmune disorders, we see a lot of turnover of different therapies being used for the same patient, because not all patients can respond to any individual monoclonal antibody, and it's hard to predict that, right? So we see a lot of cycling through of patients. In the case of anti-TNFs, we see less of that, say in the case of filgrastim, because there's really not any good alternative. So these are, again, sort of dimensions that are relevant to how the biosimilars get adopted, how quickly they become part of standard practice. Sort of separate from the initiation versus the switching point is these molecules are different, and that does have an impact in terms of the uptake and the utilization levels of the biosimilars. So I realize I've gone 5 minutes over. So again, this is a list of kind of why we see these variations between classes, the length of treatment, and whether we're on a short treatment cycle or a long treatment cycle has an impact on whether switching is important or not. Patient administration is different than a administration by a healthcare professional. So, self-injectable biologics, we can expect will look different in terms of patient receptivity to a biosimilar alternative than if the patient is receiving the drug administered by a healthcare professional. The potential for innovation and the magnitude of the innovation that's going on in the class, we think is also an important consideration. And then the point I made earlier about the level of clinical evidence, the speed with which that evidence is being gathered, and the effectiveness of the champions of that evidence will also result in variations between classes. So I'll just leave you with one slide, again, as I think about all of this here in Alberta. And I would say, three things for you all to be thinking about. One is to, start with the solution, right? What's really important from Alberta's health system perspective? And I'm not going to answer that question for you, but it's clearly something around safe, high quality, reliable supply of medicines for the citizens of your province. It's about appropriate use of medicines for patients, and it's about a sustainable health system that's also improving over time, right? So I think articulating what's important from Alberta's health system perspective should be the first step. Second, what should the role be of reimbursement policy? And to what extent is it driving a sustainable and competitive marketplace? To what extent is it important to reinforce appropriate use? What should be the role of different stakeholders in decision-making about a patient's care? And what's the role in the context of allocating available funds? And then finally, how will you know if the policy works? And I think this, again, we'll come back to some of this in the afternoon, but it's how to set what I would call explicit, measurable goals for 1 year from now, for 2 years from now, for 5 years from now. How will you actually be able to get the information to know whether you are making progress towards those goals, and what are the mechanisms to ensure that there's appropriate interpretation of that information relative to the goals, and back to the first point in terms of what's really important from the health system perspective. So again, that's my sort of 2 cents worth in terms of things to consider, and I'm sure we'll get to talking about these as the day goes by. So I think I covered a lot of territory. I hope that's been helpful in sort of providing a starting point for today, giving a sense of why this is important, how this is playing out in different parts of, particularly of Europe, what we're actually seeing in quantitative terms, and then some of the considerations for you to consider. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to the discussion and the full day. Thanks.
So Murray, sorry, I'll just get you to stay up there for just one more second, and just have the opportunity for the audience to ask 1 or 2 questions if there was anything that you thought needed clarification before you go into your breakout groups. Yes, Greg? We have a mic coming, so just wait for the mic.
Thanks, Murray. Greg Eberhardt, Alberta College of Pharmacists. It strikes me that so much of your discussion is really about economics as compared to clinical care. I mean, we can accept that there's a difference between similarity versus equivalence, so we differentiate those markets. But the context of much of your presentation is around economic managed care type strategies. Can you break that down and differentiate your presentation? That is to say, what is there unique within your presentation that applies to biosimilars that doesn't apply to the generic small molecule scenario?
Well, I think where you're question is going is I didn't talk about the importance of gathering and looking at the clinical evidence of whether biosimilars are whether biosimilars are delivering value measured in patient outcomes, whether they're introducing new risks and safety issues into the health system. I do believe that for biosimilars to play a meaningful role in health systems, we do need a lot more, what we refer to as real-world evidence that's clinically focused, similar to what Norway is at the front of the pack gathering with respect to anti-TNFs, to help make everybody comfortable about what exactly does similarity, non-equivalence, non-identical molecules, what does that actually mean? And I think we're still very much at the beginning stages of understanding that. So what's important is to be able to track utilization outcomes, to be able to interpret that in the right way, to build the evidence that's needed to demonstrate that biosimilars can play a useful role, when they can play a useful role, and when they should be avoided, right? For what kinds of patients and what kinds of circumstances is it better not to use the biosimilar and to use the reference product, right? We don't have any good way of knowing that today. It'll only be through the accumulation of evidence through registries or other use of real-world evidence that is increasingly digitized and out there, and I'm sure Alberta has an integrated health system that would enable that sort of information to be gathered. Oh, okay, sorry. Yes, thank you for the confirmation. But if that's and I didn't talk about that, but it is it's absolutely a critical part of the equation, is building that clinical evidence, and I think again we'll hear more about that with other speakers. Yeah. Well, and you can see what is being done in Europe. What I say when I'm in Europe is, you're using biosimilars quite a lot. Here's the evidence, right? But are you gathering all the information you need to be? And again, my sense is it's not as well organized as it could be and should be, and indeed must be, to help evolve the role of biosimilars so that in 10 years or in 20 years from now, we have the confidence as to what they are good for.
So good point to keep on. Ada, we'll take one more question.
Yeah.
Just wait for the mic so everyone can hear him. Sorry about that.
Sorry, just briefly, great presentation. Your points on the different factors that influence uptake of biosimilars across countries, you didn't mention in there, and I'm just wondering if there's any evidence to support whether from the patient perspectives, attitudes, informed consumerism in some countries versus others, or culture towards prescribers, if that has any influence at all.
So it should be a factor. We've not been able to identify any real differentiation across countries sort of around that. And if we do, it's really because of the physician attitudes rather than the consumer or the patient attitudes. I think it should be a bigger deal. And if you hear me talk in the US, when I say the US system is not preparing for biosimilars in the right way, a lot of that is around, there's no effort that I can tell for patients to be educated and informed about biosimilars. So I think it's a big missing piece in the US.
We can give them the video.
Yeah, well, right, but and some of us remember how long it took for small molecule generics to be accepted Now there are 88% of all prescriptions, but it took a while, and I think it's important. But again, we've struggled to find any real evidence that specific patient programs have made a difference. I think the focus is still on the physician. Again, as the type of molecules and self-injected molecules, whether it be insulins or the anti-TNFs that are self-injected, right? The patient perception will be much more important for those drugs.